The night didn't just fall in the Montana Territory, it collapsed. And on that night in 1878, it collapsed in a storm of orange and red, a roaring inferno that used to be the Sullivan homestead. The heat was a living thing, a monster that warped the air and made the world tremble. Jackson Sullivan kicked through the flaming skeleton of his own front door. Smoke clawed at his lungs, thick and black. He pressed a soaked handkerchief to his face, a useless shield against the furnace. The only thing in his mind was a single name, a single person. William! His voice was swallowed by the fire's roar. It was like shouting into a hurricane. Overhead, a support beam cracked with the sound of a giant bone snapping. A shower of glowing red embers rained down on his shoulders, burning through his shirt, searing his skin. He didn't slow down. William, where are you? The inside of the house was a nightmare. The table where they'd eaten 1,000 meals was a black, twisted husk. The walls that had echoed with 2 decades of brotherly laughter were groaning, surrendering to the flames. It was hell made real. Then he heard it, a faint cough from the back room. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through Jackson's chest. He stumbled forward, half blind, his eyes streaming from the smoke and the tears. And that's when he saw him, William, pinned beneath a massive fallen beam, his face a mask of soot and blood. His leg was twisted at an angle that wasn't natural. The sight ripped a raw sound from Jackson's throat. Jack! William's voice was a broken whisper, barely audible over the inferno. Get out! The roof! It's going! Jackson didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around the colossal piece of timber, his muscles screaming in protest. Not without you! He heaved, his boots slipping in the thick ash covering the floor. The beam didn't budge. It was like trying to move a mountain. Just hold on! William's eyes, the same shade of blue as his own, met his, and in them, Jackson saw a terrible, final clarity. It's too late, brother. No! Jackson roared, the sound torn from the deepest part of his soul. He heaved again, every fiber of his being focused on the impossible weight. His skin was blistering from the heat, the air so hot it felt like swallowing fire. I can move it! Something shifted above them, a deep, agonizing groan of wood giving up its fight. The entire structure was about to come down. William reached out, his grip surprisingly strong on Jackson's wrist. The violin, he gasped, his breath ragged. Take it, and go. Damn the violin, Jackson screamed, his vision blurring. But William's gaze was locked on his, fierce and unyielding, even as the ceiling began to collapse in a shower of sparks and flame. Promise me. The last thing Jackson would ever see of his brother were those eyes, resigned, peaceful, as the burning rafters came down like the jaws of a dragon, separating them forever. 3 years later, the wind was a knife, carving its way across the endless Montana plains. Jackson Sullivan rode west, the rising sun a distant cold fire at his back. His hand rested on the saddle horn, a heavy, permanent weight. The world had gone quiet after the fire, and it had stayed that way. His bay mare, Sadi, moved with an easy rhythm born from 1,000 miles of shared silence. Dust was etched into the lines of his face, into the leather of his coat. Sleep was a stranger he no longer expected to visit. He scanned the horizon, a habit from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Clouds were gathering in the distance. A storm was coming. He'd need shelter. He saw the broken wagon just after midday. It was tilted at a drunken angle, one of its rear wheels splintered and useless. In another life, he might have ridden past. Other people's troubles weren't his concern anymore. But Sadie, the mare who'd been with him since before the fire, slowed on her own. It was as if the horse had kept the conscience her rider had lost. A woman stood beside the wagon. Her skirts were caked in dust, and a hand shielded her eyes from the sun. Dark hair, pulled back in a loose braid, was coming undone in the relentless prairie wind. There was something in the way she stood, back straight, shoulders squared despite her obvious exhaustion, that made Jackson pull on the reins. He got closer, close enough to see her face. Not young, but not old. A face that had seen its share of hardship but hadn't been broken by it. She looked up. Her eyes met his. And for the first time in 3 years, Jackson felt something shift in his chest. A rusty gear grinding into motion, a forgotten lock turning. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight lift at the corner of her mouth, a simple acknowledgement of another soul on a hard road. But it hit Jackson with the force of a physical blow. It was the first real smile he'd seen directed at him since the world burned down. He swung himself off Sadi, his joints stiff. "Afternoon," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," she replied. Her voice was steady, calm, which was strange for someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. "You wouldn't happen to have a wrench, would you?" Jackson looked at the wagon. The wheel was shattered, but that wasn't the worst of it. The axle was split clean in two. He noticed something else, too. A deep gouge in the wood near the brake, too clean to be from the crash. It looked almost deliberate, but he kept that thought to himself. "Axle's cracked too," she said, following his gaze. "I tried to fix it, but—" She gestured to her skirts with a dry smile. "I'm not much of a blacksmith." Her calmness was unsettling. Most folks would be panicked, desperate, but she stood there like she was merely waiting for a train that was a few minutes late. "You out here alone?" he asked, his eyes scanning the empty plains. It was a dangerous place for anyone, let alone a woman on her own. "No." She motioned toward the inside of the wagon. "My son is inside. He's sleeping. He's 6. Jackson moved closer. He peered into the shadowy interior and saw a small boy, curled up under a thin woolen blanket. Dark lashes rested on cheeks that were a little too pale. A protective feeling, fierce and unfamiliar, stirred in his gut. "Where's your husband?" The question came out blunter than he'd intended. Her smile didn't falter, but a coolness entered her eyes, a shudder coming down. "Gone. Fever took him last winter, near Fort Benton." Jackson just nodded. Death was common currency in this territory. No need to say more. "I'm Jackson Sullivan." "Eleanor Reed," she replied. "And that's Thomas." She glanced at her sleeping son, and the look on her face was so full of raw, fierce love that Jackson had to look away. It felt like trespassing on sacred ground. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, the only sound between them. "Well, Mrs. Reed," Jackson said, dusting his hands on his trousers, "if you're not in a hurry, I could take a look at that axle." Relief flickered across her face so fast he almost missed it. She masked it quickly with pride. "I'd be grateful," she said. Then with that same hint of dry humor, she added, "And no, I'm not in a hurry to get anywhere at the moment." He crouched by the broken wagon, his calloused hands moving over the splintered wood and bent metal. The damage was bad, worse than he'd first thought. "This will take more than a wrench," he said, straightening up. "The axle's split clean through. You won't make it a mile, even if we could get the wheel back on." Eleanor sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "I figured as much." She looked down the empty trail, a trail that led to absolutely nowhere. "How far to the nearest town?" "Lewistown's a day's ride northeast. Good-sized place. They'll have what you need." He paused. "It'll cost you, though." He saw the familiar calculation in her eyes, the mental tally of dwindling coins and dwindling hope. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 3 years. "You got supplies?" he asked. "Some dried beans, bacon, not much water." She glanced at the horizon, where the storm clouds he'd noticed earlier were building, turning the sky a bruised purple. "We were heading to my sister's in Helena. She has a farm there." Jackson looked at the approaching storm. "You won't make it before nightfall, not on foot." He shifted his weight, a war going on inside him. The part of him that died in the fire told him to ride on, to leave her to her fate. But the part of him that had felt that jolt when she smiled, that part had other ideas. He couldn't leave a woman and child out here with that storm coming. He just couldn't. "I can take you and the boy to Lewistown," he heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth. "You can rest there, get a new wagon." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to read the fine print of his offer. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me?" The question was so direct it knocked the wind out of him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and an answer came from a place he didn't know he still had. a place that hadn't been turned to ash. Because you smiled at me, he said, his voice rough, like I was still a person worth noticing. Her breath hitched, a tiny sound, but in the vast silence of the prairie, it was as loud as a gunshot. Then she nodded, just once, a gesture both graceful and decisive. All right, Mr. Sullivan. As he helped her gather what little they could salvage from the wagon, he saw a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tucked away among her belongings. As she lifted it, the wrappings shifted. For a split second, Jackson saw the polished wood of a pistol grip. Beside it, tucked into the same bundle, was a letter, and on that letter he saw the official seal of a sheriff's office. Eleanor quickly rewrapped the bundle, her movements too swift, too practiced. Her eyes, when they met his, held a silent warning, the look of someone who had secrets and intended to keep them buried deep. Jackson said nothing. Out here, everyone carried ghosts. He was in no position to judge hers. They were almost done loading the essentials onto Sadi when the boy woke up. He climbed out of the wagon, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He was small for his age, with the same serious, assessing eyes as his mother. Thomas, Eleanor said gently, this is Mr. Sullivan. He's going to help us get to town. The boy Thomas looked at Jackson. His gaze was unnervingly direct. He didn't look at Jackson's face. He looked at the long, narrow case strapped to his saddle. The violin case. Is that a fiddle? The boy asked, his voice small but clear. Jackson felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a cold hand squeezing his heart. Yes, he managed to say. Can you play Shenandoah? The boy's question was so sudden, so specific, it felt like a punch to the gut. Before Jackson could form an answer, Eleanor put a hand on her son's shoulder. Thomas, Mr. Sullivan is helping us. Don't bother him with questions. It's all right, Jackson said, though it wasn't all right at all. He hadn't opened that case in 3 years. The latches were rusted shut with grief. I don't play much anymore. My pa played Shenandoah every night, Thomas continued, his voice full of a child's simple conviction. He said it was the prettiest song ever made. The blood drained from Jackson's face. Shenandoah. It had been William's favorite, the song he'd played on the porch as the sun set over their ranch, the last song Jackson had ever heard him play. The coincidence was a physical blow. It knocked the air from his lungs. What were the chances? Eleanor's hand tightened on her son's shoulder. Thomas, she said, her voice gentle but firm, help me with these blankets. The boy obeyed, but his eyes lingered on the violin case with a look of pure, unadulterated longing. Jackson had to turn away. He walked over to Sadie, pretending to check her saddle girth, his mind reeling. He could hear it in his head, the sweet, mournful notes of the violin. William's fingers dancing over the strings. The music that had been the soundtrack to his life, now silenced forever. When he finally had himself under control, he turned back. Eleanor and Thomas were waiting, their meager possessions piled at their feet. The storm was closer now, the sky to the west a dark, angry bruise. The wind carried the distant rumble of thunder. We should move, Jackson said, his voice clipped. That's going to hit hard. Eleanor nodded. She lifted Thomas onto Sadie's back before Jackson could even offer to help. The boy settled into the saddle, his small hands gripping the horn like he'd been born there. Jackson helped Eleanor mount up behind him, noting how she moved with a fluid, efficient grace. She was a woman used to doing things for herself. He took Sadie's reins and started walking, leading them northeast, toward Lewistown, toward a future he couldn't possibly imagine. The sky tore open just as they reached the line shack. Rain came down in solid, gray sheets, turning the world into a blur. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. They stumbled into the small, weathered structure, soaked and shivering. It wasn't much, just a one-room shack, abandoned by ranchers years ago. It smelled of dust and mice and time, but it had 4 walls and a roof that mostly held, and in the corner, a small iron stove. It was a palace. Jackson got a fire going while Eleanor spread a blanket on the floor for Thomas. The boy was exhausted, his face pale in the flickering lamplight. He was asleep before his head even hit the blanket. Eleanor sat near the stove, her hands stretched out to the growing warmth. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face, making her look younger, more vulnerable. "You always ride alone?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper so as not to wake her son. Jackson settled on the floor across from her, his back against the rough-hewn wall. "Mostly." She looked at him, her gaze steady and direct. "Why?" It was the second time she'd cut straight through his defenses with a simple question. He didn't answer right away. He just watched the rain lash against the shack's single grimy window. "Lost my brother," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. 3 years ago, we had a ranch together near Miles City, a fire. He didn't need to say more. The word fire explained everything. After he was gone, I couldn't stay. Eleanor nodded, her eyes soft with an understanding that went beyond mere sympathy. "I lost my sister to cholera. Then, my husband." She looked down at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You think you're done with grief, and then it finds a way to hollow you out all over again." The raw truth of her words hit him hard. He'd spent 3 years trying to outrun that hollow feeling, only to find it waiting for him at every sunrise. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the storm raged. But inside the tiny shack, a fragile peace began to settle. Jackson found himself watching her, the way the firelight caught the stray strands of hair that had escaped her braid, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw. She was a woman who had been tested by life and had refused to break. She looked up and caught him watching. This time he didn't look away. "You smiled at me," he said again, his voice low. "Back at the wagon." "Yes." "Why?" She tilted her head, a small, curious gesture. "Because you look like a man who hadn't been smiled at in a very long time." A sound escaped his lips that was almost a laugh, but it was too full of pain. "You have no idea what that did to me." Her gaze held his. "What did it do?" "It reminded me that I'm still alive." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. He hadn't meant to say it, but the words had come out anyway. Eleanor reached across the small space that separated them. Her fingers brushed against his knuckles. Just a light, fleeting touch. But it sent a jolt of warmth through him, a current of feeling so foreign and so achingly familiar, it nearly made him gasp. "Being alive hurts sometimes," she said softly. "Yes." He didn't pull his hand away. He couldn't. "But maybe," she continued, her voice a quiet murmur, "maybe that's how you know you're doing it right." They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. The fire burned low. The storm outside began to recede, its fury spent. Her hand rested on his, a small point of contact in a world that had felt empty for so long. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. Something had passed between them, a silent understanding, a shared recognition of the scars they both carried. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless. And for the first time in 3 years, Jackson Sullivan didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible blue and air that smelled of wet earth and pine. As they rode northeast, the land itself seemed to be telling a story. They passed through a stretch of prairie that had been blackened by a fire weeks, maybe months ago. Charred stalks of grass stood like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. It was a landscape of death. But then Thomas, who had been sitting quietly in the saddle in front of his mother, pointed a small finger. "Look." Amidst the devastation, a single purple wildflower had pushed its way through the ash. Its color was a defiant splash of life against the black, scorched earth. "Life finds a way," Eleanor murmured, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. Jackson just nodded, but the image seared itself into his mind. Life pushing through the ashes. Around midday, they were watering Saudi at a small, clear creek when he saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted on the ridge ahead. They were moving at a steady, unhurried pace, but there was a purposefulness to their movement that sent a familiar warning signal up Jackson's spine. These weren't ranchers. These weren't drifters. These were hunters. "Wait here," he said to Eleanor, his voice low and quiet. He handed her Sadie's reins and stepped forward, placing himself between her and the approaching men. His hand rested casually near the hilt of the hunting knife on his belt. He'd given up carrying a gun after William died. He hated the noise, the violence. But he was far from defenseless. The riders drew closer. Two older, hard-faced men, and a younger one in the lead. The young one had the cold, flat eyes of a man who enjoyed his work, especially when his work involved hurting people. "Morning," the young rider called out, his eyes sliding right past Jackson and fixing on Eleanor. "Fine day for traveling." "It is," Jackson replied, his voice a low rumble. He didn't move. He was a rock, a wall. The riders pulled up a few feet away. The young man leaned forward in his saddle, his gaze lingering on Eleanor, with an insolent appraisal that made Jackson's hand tighten on the hilt of his knife. "You folks headed to Lewistown?" "We are." "Funny coincidence," the man said, a smile touching his lips but not reaching his eyes. "We're looking for someone, a woman and a boy. Might be headed that way." His gaze never left Eleanor. Her face had gone pale, her arm tightening around Thomas, who was pressing himself against her, trying to become invisible. "Can't say that we have," Jackson said, his voice as flat and empty as the plains around them. "Trail's been quiet." The young man nodded slowly, still staring at Eleanor. "Is that so?" He straightened up. "Well, if you do happen to run across a woman named Eleanor Reed and her son, you might let her know her husband is mighty concerned about her." Jackson felt the air go out of the world. He felt Eleanor's sharp intake of breath behind him. "Her husband?" he repeated, keeping his face a mask of stone. "Daniel Reed," the man supplied, enjoying himself now. "Good friend of mine from Fort Benton. Seems his wife and boy went missing a few months back. He's been sick with worry." The cold smile returned. "A family should stay together, don't you think?" The pieces slammed into place in Jackson's mind. The lie about the fever, the hidden gun, the sheriff's letter, the terror in the boy's eyes. Eleanor Reed wasn't a widow. She was a runaway. Jackson took a half step forward, deliberately drawing the man's attention back to him, away from her. "If I see anyone like that," Jackson said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I'll be sure to pass along the message." For a long, tense moment, the young rider held Jackson's gaze. It was a silent battle of wills, a promise of future violence. Then with a slight nod, the man touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged." He signaled to his companions, and they rode past, their horses kicking up dust that settled on Jackson's coat like a shroud. Jackson watched them until they were out of sight. Then he turned back to Eleanor. Her face was a mask of sheer terror, but her eyes were burning with a fierce, desperate light. "He's alive," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Daniel's alive." And Jackson knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that Daniel Reed was the reason she was running, and that men like the ones who had just ridden past would not stop until they dragged her back to him. They didn't speak for the first few miles. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken questions and the lingering shadow of the men on the trail. Jackson walked, leading Sadie, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, every sense on high alert. Eleanor and Thomas rode, their own silence a testament to the fear that now rode with them. When they finally crested a rise and saw the small, weathered buildings of Lewistown nestled in the valley below, a sigh of relief escaped Eleanor's lips. She met Jackson's eyes, her own full of a question she didn't need to ask. "Why are you still helping us?" It was the same question she'd asked before, but now it had a new weight. Now he knew she had lied to him. Now he knew she was in real, mortal danger. Now he knew that helping her could get him killed. He looked at the town below, a place of strangers. Then he looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and at the small boy who held on to her with a desperate grip. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said, his voice rough. He looked away back toward the town. "Even me." Lewistown was a place that kept its secrets. It was a town of wary glances and closed doors. Jackson led them away from the main street to a small cabin tucked away near the edge of town, half hidden by a grove of aspen trees. "Martha Jenkins," he explained, "a widow. She's a good woman, and more importantly, she minds her own business." Martha Jenkins turned out to be a short, sturdy woman with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Eleanor's exhausted face and Thomas's haunted eyes and simply said, "Got a room out back. It's clean enough. She didn't ask a single question. Later that evening, after Eleanor and Thomas were settled in the small private room, Jackson found himself in Martha's warm, clean kitchen. The smell of baking bread filled the air. "They're in trouble, aren't they?" Martha asked, not looking up from the dough she was kneading. "Yes," Jackson admitted. "Her husband. He's not a good man." Martha just nodded. "Figured as much. The boy has that look, the one children get when they've seen things they shouldn't." She looked up at him then, her gaze sharp. "Those men who were asking around town today, they're looking for her." A cold weight settled in Jackson's stomach. "They're here, in town?" "Staying at the boarding house," Martha confirmed. "One of them came by the store, asked if I'd seen a woman and a boy, new to town." "What did you tell him?" "Told him I mind my store and my own business." A grim smile touched her lips. "And that I keep a loaded shotgun under the counter." Despite the danger, Jackson felt a flicker of a smile. Martha Jenkins was as tough as the Montana winter. But the relief was short-lived. A knock on the door made them both freeze. Martha moved to the window, peering through the curtains. "Sheriff Mitchell," she muttered. The sheriff was a tall, weathered man with a tired face and a posture that spoke of official business. "Sullivan," he said, nodding to Jackson as he stepped inside. "Heard you rode in with company. 3 men are in town staying at the boarding house. They're saying they're looking for a runaway wife." He paused, his eyes locking onto Jackson's. "They seem real determined to find her. I'd hate to see you get caught up in trouble that isn't yours." It was a warning, but was it a friendly one? Or was the sheriff on Daniel Reed's payroll? In a town like Lewistown, it was impossible to know who to trust. After the sheriff left, Jackson went back to the small room. Eleanor was sitting by the cold stove, her hands twisting in her lap. Thomas was asleep on the narrow bed. "They're here," Jackson said quietly. "In town." Eleanor closed her eyes, a wave of despair washing over her face. "I have to tell you everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I lied to you. Daniel, my husband, he's not dead." "I figured that out," Jackson said gently. Her story came out in a torrent of hushed, painful words. Daniel Reed, the charming violinist from St. Louis. The man she had loved. The man who had promised her a new life in the West. But the West had broken him. The isolation, the hardship, it had turned him to drink, and the drink had turned him into a monster. "It started with words," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the sleeping form of her son. "Cruel words. Then he started breaking things. Then he started breaking me." She told him about the final night, about a poker game that had gone bad, about Daniel coming home in a drunken rage, a knife in his hand. "He said he was going to end all our misery," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He was going to kill us both, and then himself." She had managed to get Thomas out of the house, but when she tried to follow, Daniel had caught her. They had struggled. The knife. "There was so much blood," she whispered, her hand unconsciously going to her side. "He wasn't moving when I ran. I thought I'd killed him." Jackson listened, a cold, hard anger building in his chest. An anger directed at the man who could do this to his family. An anger directed at a world that allowed such things to happen. "And now he wants you back," Jackson finished for her. "Yes," she said, her eyes finally meeting his. They were filled with a desperate, pleading light. "Now you know. I understand if you want no part of this. Daniel is a dangerous man." Jackson looked at her, at this woman who had survived hell and was still fighting. He looked at the sleeping boy, who deserved a life free from fear, and he thought of the promise he'd made to his dying brother, a promise to protect what was good. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone," he said, the words coming from a place of deep, unshakable conviction. He wasn't just talking to her. He was talking to the ghost of his brother. He was talking to the man he wanted to be. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this?" Jackson thought about the fire, about the years of empty, silent wandering, about the moment she had smiled at him, a flicker of light in his endless darkness. "Because," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name, "I'm tired of riding with nowhere to go." He reached across the space between them, and his hand found hers. It was cold and trembling, but she gripped his with a surprising strength. And in that small room, with the sleeping boy as their witness, two broken people found a reason to keep fighting. The next day they rode north, away from Lewistown, away from the hunters. Martha had told them about a piece of land, an old abandoned homestead nestled in a protected valley, a place to disappear, a place to make a stand. The valley was beautiful, sheltered on three sides by gentle rolling hills. A clear, cold stream cut through the center, and at its heart stood a solitary stone chimney, all that was left of a cabin that had burned down years ago. "It's a good sign, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her hand resting on the weathered stone. "That something remained, even after the fire." "The old-timers would say it's lucky," Jackson replied, his eyes on her face. "A hearth that survives means the home can be rebuilt." Thomas, who had been exploring the creek, ran back to them, his face alive with a child's excitement for the first time since Jackson had met him. "Can we live here?" he asked, his voice full of a desperate hope that nearly broke Jackson's heart. Eleanor looked at Jackson. Her eyes asked a question that had nothing to do with the land. They asked about the future, about trust, about him. "We can try," Jackson said. And he wasn't just talking to the boy, but their fragile peace was shattered before it could even take root. As they were preparing to leave the valley and head back to the relative safety of Martha's, Jackson saw him, a lone rider on the far ridge, watching them. It was the young man with the cold eyes. They hadn't shaken them. They had been followed. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Jackson. He grabbed Sadie's reins. "We have to go. Now." But it was too late. Two more riders appeared on the ridge, fanning out to cut off their escape. They were trapped. Jackson made a split-second decision. He lifted Thomas into the saddle, then helped a stunned Eleanor mount up behind him. "Ride," he commanded, slapping Sadie's flank. "Follow the creek. It'll give you cover. Don't stop for anything." "Jackson, no!" Eleanor cried, her face a mask of terror. "We stay together." "I'll lead them away," he said, his voice hard. "I know this country better than they do. I can lose them." He looked at her, his eyes burning with an intensity that silenced her protests. "Go. Protect the boy. That's all that matters." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and ran, not toward the trail, but up the steep, rocky side of the valley. He was a decoy, a target. He heard shouts behind him as the riders spotted him, the thunder of hooves as they gave chase. He ran, his lungs burning, his legs pumping. He scrambled over rocks, through thorny brush. He was drawing them away from Eleanor and Thomas, away from the one small spark of hope he had found in this desolate world. He glanced back. Sadie was a distant speck, disappearing into the trees along the creek. They were safe, for now. The riders were closing in. A rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet whining past his ear, close enough to feel the heat. He dove behind a cluster of boulders as another shot kicked up a spray of dirt where he had just been. He was pinned down, 3 guns against his 1 knife. The odds were not good, but as he lay there, his heart hammering against his ribs, he didn't feel fear. He felt a strange, cold calm. He was no longer just Jackson Sullivan, the grieving brother, the aimless drifter. He was a wall, a shield, and he would not let them pass. The gunfire echoed through the empty hills. Jackson stayed low, the rough stone of the boulders digging into his cheek. He had no gun, no way to fight back from a distance. He had only his knife, his knowledge of the terrain, and a desperate burning will to survive. He had to move. Staying put was a death sentence. He waited for a lull in the shooting, then exploded from behind the rocks, sprinting toward a deep, narrow ravine 50 yards away. The world erupted in sound. Bullets kicked up dust at his heels, splintering the rock face beside him. He felt a searing pain in his left arm, a hot poker being driven through his flesh. He stumbled but didn't fall. He kept running. He launched himself into the ravine, tumbling down the steep, gravelly slope, and landing in a heap at the bottom. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. His arm was on fire. He ripped his sleeve. The bullet had gone clean through the muscle. Painful but not fatal. Not yet. He could hear the riders above shouting to each other. They would be coming down after him. He pushed himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. The ravine twisted and turned, a natural maze carved into the earth. It was his only advantage. He started moving, half running, half stumbling, deeper into the shadows. He knew where this ravine led, to the Badlands, a labyrinth of eroded hills and treacherous gullies, a place where a man could get lost and never be found. It was a gamble. If he made a wrong turn, he'd be trapped. But it was the only gamble he had. For what felt like hours, he played a deadly game of cat and mouse. He would hide, listen, then move again. He could hear them, sometimes close, sometimes distant. They were fanning out, trying to corner him. He pushed the pain in his arm to the back of his mind. He focused on the sounds, the wind, the subtle shifts in the landscape. He became a part of the wilderness, an animal, hunted and dangerous. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The temperature dropped. The cold seeped into his bones, making his wounded arm ache with a deep, throbbing intensity. He was losing blood. He was getting weaker. He found a small overhang, a shallow cave carved into a sandstone cliff. He crawled inside, collapsing onto the cold, sandy floor. He had to rest, just for a moment. He must have passed out. When he opened his eyes, it was dark. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky, and someone was standing at the entrance to the cave. It was the young rider, the one with the cold eyes. He was holding his rifle, the moonlight glinting off the long barrel. "Found you," the man said, his voice soft, almost conversational. "You led us a merry chase, Sullivan. I'll give you that." Jackson tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't obey. His arm was a dead weight. The man took a step closer. "Now you're going to tell me where she is, the woman and the boy." Jackson just stared at him, his mind racing. He had one chance, one last, desperate move. "They're gone," Jackson rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "You'll never find them." The man smiled, that cold, empty smile. "Oh, I think we will. But you won't be around to see it." He raised the rifle. Jackson's hand, his good hand, was clutching the hilt of his hunting knife. He had pulled it from its sheath before he passed out. It was his only hope. As the rider's finger tightened on the trigger, Jackson lunged. Not up, but sideways. He rolled across the cave floor, a blur of motion in the darkness. The rifle exploded, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet slammed into the rock wall, where his head had been a second before. He came up on one knee, the knife held low. The rider was fumbling to reload, his eyes wide with surprise. He hadn't expected the wounded man to have any fight left in him. That was his mistake. Jackson didn't hesitate. He drove forward, putting all of his remaining strength into a single, upward thrust. The knife slid between the man's ribs with a sickening, wet sound. The rider gasped, a look of pure shock on his face. The rifle clattered to the ground. He looked down at the handle of the knife protruding from his chest, then back up at Jackson. "Read. Will. Find." He never finished the sentence. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed. Jackson stood over him, swaying on his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence of the Badlands rushed in to fill the void left by the violence. He had killed a man. The thought didn't bring him horror. It didn't bring him satisfaction. It brought him nothing but a vast, crushing emptiness. He knew the other riders would have heard the shot. They would be coming. He had to move. He retrieved the dead man's rifle and his pistol. He took his canteen and the small pouch of ammunition from his belt. He didn't look at the man's face. Then, using the rifle as a crutch, he stumbled out of the cave and back into the cold, unforgiving night. He had to get back. He had to know if Eleanor and Thomas were safe. That single thought was the only thing that kept him moving. It was a flicker of a candle in a world of darkness. And he walked toward it, one painful, staggering step at a time. He didn't know how long he walked. An hour, a lifetime. The world was a blur of pain and exhaustion. But finally, through the haze, he saw it. A faint, flickering light in the distance. A campfire. He approached with the caution of a wolf, using the shadows the rifle held ready. As he got closer, he saw Sadi, peacefully grazing nearby. And then he saw them. Eleanor was sitting by the fire, her arms wrapped around a sleeping Thomas. Her face was pale, strained, but she was alert, her eyes scanning the darkness. She was holding the pistol he'd seen in her bundle, holding it like she knew how to use it. When she saw him step into the firelight, a ghost emerging from the darkness, a strangled cry escaped her lips. She was on her feet in an instant, rushing toward him. "Jackson!" He collapsed into her arms, the last of his strength giving out. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling as she saw the blood-soaked sleeve of his shirt. "They're gone," he managed to say. "One of them. He won't be coming back." She didn't ask for details. She just helped him to the fire, her arm a strong, steady support around his waist. She cleaned and bandaged his wound with a practiced efficiency that spoke of a life filled with hardship. As she worked, he watched her face in the firelight. The fear was still there, in the back of her eyes, but it was overshadowed by something else, a fierce, unyielding resolve. When she was done, she sat beside him, the pistol resting in her lap. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jackson looked at the sleeping boy, who had not stirred. He looked at the vast, star-filled sky above them. And he knew with a certainty that settled the chaos in his soul that running was no longer an option. "We go back," he said. "We go back to that valley, to that chimney." He met her gaze, his eyes burning with a new, hard-won clarity. "And we stop running. We build." Eleanor didn't speak for a long moment. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his. Then a slow smile touched her lips. Not the small, cautious smile from their first meeting. This was a real smile, a smile of hope. "Okay, Mr. Sullivan," she said softly. "Let's build." They made it back to the valley. The chimney stood as they had left it, a silent sentinel waiting for their return. It became the heart of their world. Jackson, his arm healing slowly, began the back-breaking work of building. He felled trees, hewed logs, his body aching but his purpose clear. Eleanor worked beside him, her soft hands becoming calloused, her quiet strength a constant source of inspiration. Thomas, seeing the adults work with such fierce determination, became a boy again. He explored the creek, learned the names of the birds, his laughter echoing through the valley, a sound of pure, untainted joy. Martha Jenkins became their lifeline. She would ride out from Lewistown every week, bringing supplies and news. The other two riders had left town, she told them. No one knew where they went, and Daniel Reed had not been seen or heard from. For a time, it seemed like they were safe, that they had found their sanctuary. But the ghost of Daniel Reed still haunted them, and one day a letter arrived with Martha, a letter that would change everything. It was from a man in Helena, a lawyer. He was writing on behalf of a Mr. Sheridan Wallace. "The name means anything to you?" Jackson asked, watching Eleanor's face as she read the letter. All the color drained from her cheeks. "Wallace," she whispered, the name a curse on her lips. He was Daniel's business partner. The letter was an offer. Mr. Wallace knew of her situation. He was prepared to offer her legal protection, a formal, binding divorce from Daniel Reed. In exchange, he wanted something from her. Information. Specifically information about a business deal between Daniel and a third partner, a man named William Sullivan. Jackson felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "William?" he said, his voice a strangled whisper. "My brother?" Eleanor looked up from the letter, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "The violin," she breathed. "Daniel played Shenandoah. He said he learned it from a friend he'd met in St. Louis, a friend who moved to Montana to start a ranch." The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for years, began to slam into place. The fire, the violin, the song, it was all connected. "What was the business deal?" Jackson demanded, his voice raw. "I don't know," Eleanor said, her hands trembling. "Daniel never told me, but there were secret meetings, men coming to the house late at night. There were arguments about a mining claim, a silver mine." A silver mine. William had never mentioned a silver mine. The letter from Wallace was not an offer of help. It was a threat. Wallace was cleaning up loose ends. And Eleanor, the wife of one of his partners, was a loose end. And Jackson, the brother of another partner, was a ghost who had just walked back into the land of the living. "The fire," Jackson said, the words like stones in his mouth. "It wasn't an accident." He looked at the cabin they were building, the home they were creating, And he knew with a chilling certainty that the real storm had not yet passed. It was still coming, and its name was Wallace. Jackson rode to Miles City. He had to know the truth. He left Eleanor and Thomas in the valley with a rifle and a promise. "I'll be back." The lawyer in Miles City who had handled William's estate was a small, nervous man named Finch. When Jackson mentioned the names Daniel Reed and Sheridan Wallace, Finch tried to stonewall him. "Client confidentiality," he'd said, polishing his spectacles with a shaking hand. Jackson leaned across the desk, his face a mask of cold fury. "William was my brother, and he was murdered. Now you are going to tell me everything you know." The story Finch told, reluctantly, was one of greed and betrayal. William, Reed, and Wallace had been partners in a silver mine, a rich claim that was worth a fortune, but they had disagreed on how to develop it. William had wanted to proceed slowly, safely. Wallace had wanted to rip the silver out of the ground as fast as possible, cutting corners, risking lives for profit. Reed had been caught in the middle. Finch gave Jackson copies of the partnership agreements, of letters that had passed between the three men, and in one of those letters Jackson found it. A letter from Wallace to Reed, dated 2 weeks before the fire. "Our mutual problem requires a permanent resolution," Wallace had written. "I trust you will handle the matter with the appropriate discretion." It wasn't a confession, but it was a death sentence. Jackson rode back to the valley with a storm in his heart. He rode with a single burning purpose: justice for William. He pushed Sadie hard, taking a treacherous shortcut through the mountains. He had to get back to Eleanor, to warn her. Wallace knew she existed. He would be coming for her. He crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. And he saw it. Smoke was rising from their chimney. But there was a strange horse tethered outside the cabin, and there was a figure slumped on the ground. He spurred Sadie down the slope, his mind screaming. He was too late. He slid from the saddle before the mare had even stopped. The man on the ground was Joseph Blackfoot, one of the carpenters Martha had sent to help them build. He was alive, barely, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Reed!" Joseph gasped, his eyes flickering open. "He found them. He's inside." Jackson's world narrowed to the open cabin door. He could hear shouting, a man's voice, crazed and desperate, Eleanor's voice sharp and defiant. He grabbed the rifle from his saddle. He moved toward the cabin, silent as a shadow. He peered through the doorway. Daniel Reed was in the center of the room. He was a wreck of a man, thin, wild-eyed, a pistol clutched in his shaking hand. He had Eleanor by the arm, her face bruised and bleeding, but her eyes were blazing with a fire that matched his own. Thomas was cowering in the corner, his small face a mask of terror. "Where is it, Eleanor?" Reed shrieked, his voice cracking. "The proof! Wallace thinks you have it. The papers that prove what he did." "There are no papers, Daniel," she cried, struggling against his grip. Jackson raised the rifle, but he didn't have a clear shot. Reed was using Eleanor as a shield. He had to draw him out. Jackson stepped into the doorway. "Reed!" Daniel Reed spun around, dragging Eleanor with him, the pistol swinging toward Jackson. "Sullivan!" Reed hissed, a mad grin spreading across his face. "William's little brother. Come for revenge?" "Let her go, Reed," Jackson said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is between you and me." "It's always been between us," Reed screamed. "You and your righteous brother. He wouldn't listen. I told him Wallace was a snake. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't run." In that moment, Jackson saw the truth. Reed wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a weak man, a coward who had gotten in over his head. He hadn't set the fire, but his weakness, his greed, had led to William's death, and he had been running from that guilt ever since. Eleanor saw her chance. She stomped down hard on Reed's foot and drove her elbow into his ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a split second. It was all she needed. She tore free, scrambling toward Thomas. Reed recovered, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He raised the pistol, aiming it at Eleanor's back. Jackson lunged forward, but he knew he wouldn't be fast enough. A deafening roar filled the cabin. It wasn't Reed's pistol. It was a shotgun. Daniel Reed staggered. a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the massive hole that had appeared in his chest. The pistol fell from his hand. He collapsed to the floor and didn't move again. Jackson whirled around. Martha Jenkins stood in the doorway, the smoking shotgun held in her steady hands. "Saw the strange horse from the ridge," she said, her voice as calm and practical as ever. "Figured you might need some help." Eleanor rushed into Jackson's arms, pulling Thomas with her. They clung to each other, three survivors in a world that had tried its best to break them. The sheriff from Lewistown ruled it self-defense. Joseph Blackfoot, who survived his wound, testified to what he had seen. Daniel Reed was buried in a nameless grave on the edge of town. His ghost was finally laid to rest. But the ghost of Sheridan Wallace still loomed. Jackson took the papers to the territorial marshal in Helena. The letters, the partnership agreements, the proof of Wallace's greed. Combined with Eleanor's testimony about her husband's last crazed words, it was enough. Sheridan Wallace was arrested. His empire of corruption crumbled. Justice, slow and methodical, had finally come for the man who had ordered William's death. Jackson, Eleanor, and Thomas returned to the valley. To their valley. Winter came, blanketing the world in a deep, cleansing white. They were safe. They were together. They began to build their life, not on a foundation of vengeance or grief, but on something new, something hopeful. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the warm, sturdy cabin, Thomas looked up at Jackson. "Will you play it now?" he asked, his eyes full of a child's simple faith. "Will you play the fiddle?" Jackson looked at Eleanor. She smiled, a soft, encouraging smile that reached all the way to her eyes. He walked over to the corner where the violin case had sat, unopened, for 3 long years. He ran his hand over the worn leather. He could almost feel his brother's presence, not as a painful memory, but as a warm, peaceful blessing. He opened the case. The violin lay on its velvet bed, its polished wood gleaming in the firelight. He picked it up, the familiar weight of it settling into his hands. He raised the bow, and he played. He played Shenandoah. The sweet, mournful notes filled the small cabin, a song of loss and of love and of finding a way home. He played for his brother, he played for the family he had lost, and he played for the family he had found. Outside, the snow fell on the vast, silent Montana wilderness. But inside the small cabin, there was warmth, there was light, there was music, and there was life, pushing its way through the ashes, stronger and more beautiful than ever before. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the world. And let me know in the comments below, do you believe that a place can heal a person's soul? I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe out there.